Hi, and welcome to CryptoBiography. I'm your host, Brandon Starr. This is episode 388 of CryptoBiography, and it's a story called The Chasm. And here we go. "Come on," she shouted, ducking around the rock. "There's some kind of cave." He groaned, but the waves made it inaudible. The tide was starting to come back in, and the last thing he wanted to do was get caught in a cave for an entire high tide, or fight his way back out with Joe. The waves were already lapping up to the rocks that Joe had disappeared around. But he couldn't just let her go exploring on her own. Joe never thought about consequences. She just acted. Here she'd seen a sea cave, and her instinct was to explore it despite the rising tide and the many dangers that even the simplest cave exploration can bring. He took off after her without much further thought. He turned the corner, wading through ankle-deep and rushing water, and saw that there was a rather large cave entrance there. Joe was nowhere to be seen. "Connor?" he barely heard Joe say from inside. "Come on." He took a breath and followed. He slowed as he entered the cave. The sunlight had been nearly blinding, especially with the afternoon sun bouncing off the waves. Here it quickly turned to gloom. He saw that after an entrance almost twice as height and the same in width, the cave opened to a largish space that might have fit a tennis court, that was more strangely shaped than a mere rectangle. The smell was strongly of the sea, and the floor was sandy, and the tide was bringing water in. The floor gently rose, though the tides brought in sand for quite a way. The cavern also narrowed slightly as he moved forward. Joe was up ahead, her tanned skin still looking bright in the gloom as she appeared around some further archway. He was a little less worried now. The floor had gone up enough that it was becoming bare rock, which he took as meaning that they couldn't be trapped by rising waters. If need be, they could wait out the tide. He strode forward, and now Joe was waiting for him. "It keeps going," she said. She brought out her phone and turned on the light. He did the same, noting that already his had no signal, it being blocked by the thick rocks above. They moved forward. "Careful," he advised aloud. "There could be cracks or cliffs. We must not fall into them." She gave a slight grunt that sounded like grudging acknowledgement. He glanced over at her. Even in the gloom, lit only by what light was bouncing up off the floor from their phones, he found her beautiful. He couldn't say exactly why. She had an unusual face, mixed curves and planes that no one else had anything close to. But he'd fallen for her the moment they'd met the second week of college. Now they were seniors. He'd watched Joe date various people, men and women, and he'd never found the courage to ask her out when she was between lovers. He didn't know why he couldn't ask her. He'd always just balked at the wrong time, and when he had gotten his courage back up, it had been too late. He wasn't even sure if she was seeing anyone at the moment. But now wasn't the time to concern himself with it. Maybe after the cave. They kept going back further and further. Connor found himself wondering why he'd never heard about this cave before. It was off the path, true, not near any of the typical beaches that people went on the Oregon coast, but the beach was hardly unknown. They continued on, and the path got narrower. He believed it was also still going upward slightly, though it was difficult to be sure. Time began to slip away. For some reason, he couldn't bring himself to look at the clock on his phone, even though that should have been able to clarify things for him. Instead, they moved forward, and his consciousness got more and more fuzzy. Then it was as if he woke up. The path had suddenly widened, the walls disappearing into total darkness to each side. The cavern they'd come upon must have been huge. Their lights did nothing to illuminate the other side. Joe took his hand in hers and stepped forward. What that touch meant, if anything, he had no idea. They crept forward carefully, one foot carefully placed before the other. Then they saw it. It was a chasm of unknown depth. The crack it formed seemed to break the cavern into two. Who knew what was on the other side? They could barely make out the far side of the chasm with their phone lights, but in the incredible darkness that was oppressing them from all sides, it was also making the distance difficult to discern. Certainly they couldn't hope to jump to it. Joe got down on her belly and crawled to the edge. "What are you doing?" Connor asked in what sounded to him like a frightened hiss. "I'm going to see how deep this is, or if it's filled with seawater," she said. She slithered up to the edge. She must have found a small rock because she held it up so he could see what she had, then turned her hand over past the edge. The rock fell and fell, but they heard nothing. "No sound?" Joe asked, puzzled. "Maybe that means there's water and it just hit in a way that made a little splash," Connor suggested, but it didn't seem likely. He decided he had to do what she'd done, so he got to his knees, then down on his belly and crawled beside her. There were a few rocks around. He found a bigger one. He held it out so she could see it, then reached out and tipped his hand over and let it fall into the chasm. It fell and fell. Jo had put her phone over the edge with the light pointing down, and she was clearly watching his larger rock disappear. But no sound. "See anything?" Connor asked. She did not reply. He struggled forward to the edge and looked down himself. He assumed he would see nothing, or almost nothing, beyond blackness, and for a moment that's what he saw. But then there was movement. Something in the deeps was swirling and turning. Was it coming closer to him? He couldn't tell, but he also couldn't move. And it was far too late for Connor, and for Jo, and for whatever they had between them. And no one ever discovered their fate. And that's the end of the story this week. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any comments or questions about this episode or previous episodes, cryptobiography@gmail.com, or hit us up on Facebook, X, or Mastodon. And I haven't done Blue Sky yet, but I probably will soon. If you have, thank you for listening. And words and music, copyright 2024, Brandon Starr, all rights reserved. Characters and events are fictional, fictionalized, or satirical.